Hey guys, this is Colin from Blackjack Apprenticeship, and I'm joined with my co-host for the day, SD1, and with BJA Forum moderator and full-time AP, Nichols. How you doing, Nichols?
I'm alive. How are you doing?
I as well am alive. How are you doing, SD1?
Yeah, heart's still pumping.
We happen to be in town for a Blackjack boot camp that we have this weekend and realized it's been almost 5 years since the original Nichols podcast, and want to catch up with you. We've got a lot of awesome questions that people have put together. And so let's jump right into it. Sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. Well, let's start with, people should listen to Nichols 1.0 podcast. If they haven't, we just rebroadcast it recently, and it was fun to re-listen to it. There's so many unique games you got into pretty early into your career, but maybe you could share with people a little bit of what you've been into since last time.
Well, it's gotten quite a bit more boring since then because I'm in front of a video poker machine most of the time. And it's not always boring, but royal flushes only come around 1 in 40,000 hands or so. So most of the time it's just a slow downward trajectory until it comes and then, oh, now you're happy.
So that would be like if Blackjack was, the big payout was, let's say, a suited Blackjack against a dealer's ace or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
That paid 1,000 to 1 or whatever, that you're playing without the edge until you hit the royal.
Yeah, basically. And so, and a lot of times with video poker, your edge is really small, often as small as with counting cards, sometimes even smaller. So if you're working with, a 0.5% edge and that royal flush is worth 2% of the return, you're basically playing a game with a 1.5% house edge until the royal flush comes in.
So basically, you just get kicked in the balls repeatedly until you don't.
Oh yeah, I'm a full-blown masochist.
Outside of masochism, why the video poker?
I think the big thing is just that it happened to be available to me. There was a point in time that I was not in love with Blackjack anymore, and I was having sort of a rough go of it. And a friend of mine who I had shared intel with on Blackjack at one of my favorite places had happened to have found a video poker game that was a really good opportunity. And I say video poker, it was actually video Blackjack. But that sort of propelled me into looking at video poker. And I realized that the market I was in at the time had a lot of video poker opportunities. And it was less of a going out of my way to find video poker and more of like, oh, hey, here's something I can do without traveling too far that I can get a lot of hours in doing, because the backoffs don't come as quickly or as often with video poker. It's not something that they're on the lookout for all the time.
It's just like in card counting when you find a place that just lets you play and play and play. With VP, you can just go to your shop and grind away.
Yeah, for the most part, as long as you have the edge that day.
Right.
And a lot of times, like, I have been trespassed for that type of activity before, but most of the time they just change the game. Like, you don't even get 86 to most of the time. It's just they change the game or they change the promotion you were attacking or something like that.
And so are you exclusively doing video poker?
No, I do a little bit of most things. Video poker happens to be like the thing I do the most of. But I do a little bit of sports. I do play some Blackjack from time to time. I counted cards a few weeks ago, matter of fact. And then, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have wanted to say this out loud because it was still kind of a secret then, but now it's less of a secret. I do some slot stuff too.
And you also are a regular at our boot camps, have been since basically post-COVID open up, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So boot camp staff as well.
Let's talk about something really exciting. Moderating the Blackjack Apprenticeship forums. That's got to be the highlight of your day every day. All the amazing questions that come to you.
Well, I spend so much time on there, I must enjoy it.
Well, what are some common questions you get moderating this community?
So I think on the forum, some of the more common things have to do usually with misunderstanding a deviation or maybe not fully understanding. 8-8 versus 10 comes up a lot.
Classic.
Seems like at least once a week. Bankroll management stuff comes up a lot too. And I think the big thing really with both of those that'll help alleviate those is like one, like don't be afraid to ask if you really are having trouble with it. But two, like the tools are there on the site to help you. So see if you can figure it out on your own first, and that'll help with a lot of other stuff that you'll encounter as an AP down the road where those critical thinking skills are really important. Like in the pro betting software, like it's not just plug in a spread and see what your risk is. It's also, you can learn a lot about the value of penetration, let's say, or the value of one type of rule just by playing around with some things, even if you think you're not going to find a game like that. And with the 8-8 versus 10-1, I think what happens there is people think about order of operations like how they learned it in math class, which it kind of is, but it's also an order of operations of the procedures of the game, right? So like surrender comes first because if you surrender, you can't do anything else. The hand is over. But so they'll think of that and think, oh, it's 16, it should surrender. But it's not the same as a 16, right? It's a pair of eights, it has another option. And so you have to think, okay, what's the highest EV option? And those are probably the two most common things that get asked.
What are some of the common pitfalls that you see new card counters making?
I think one of them is, well, overbetting your bankroll. And I know that gets said all the time, but it's because it's important to not do that. And it happens for a number of reasons. Like sometimes it's misunderstanding what risk of ruin actually means. Sometimes it's like this has happened before, unfortunately, even though there's a little disclaimer at the bottom of the trip calculator. People will use the trip calculator and say, well, if I play for the next X number of hours, my risk is only this. And they'll use that to justify betting more than their bankroll can actually tolerate. And they really need to be using the main function of the pro betting software to look at their risk there and only use the trip calculator to plan how much cash to bring on a trip, like not to make a decision about their bet spread. And then another part of that, like I had said, is just people misunderstand what risk of ruin actually means. And like they'll have an idea of it, but they don't, you really have to think about the fact that it means that is a chance you lose all of it, not some percentage of it, not 90% of it, not most of it, not half of it, all of it, every penny. And a lot of people don't seem to appreciate that, or they think that a small number is close enough to zero that it doesn't matter. But if you're playing 100 hands an hour, think about how big a sample size you plan to get. You're going to see all sorts of crazy stuff. Even like 5%, that's a 1 in 20 event. There's 24 hours in a day. Some hour of the day, you're going to encounter a 5% event. And so I think that misunderstanding oftentimes leads to overbetting bankrolls, and that's probably the biggest pitfall.
What about underbetting? Do you see much comments in that, or like younger counters talking about like, hey, I'm not like, here are my results. I feel like this is like 2 standard deviations. What's going on? And it turns out you're saying like an underbetting situation, not a big enough spread.
Yeah, I think that comes up quite a bit too. And that's usually less from it can be from a risk perspective, but let's start with what I think is most common, which is people are afraid of heat. They think they're going to catch too much heat for spreading big. And the fact of the matter is you have to spread big to beat the game. Like you have to bet more when the count is positive and bet less when it's not, and it's pretty unga bunga stuff, count big, bet big. But it's hard and it's uncomfortable and it's weird. Like the other people in the casino aren't doing that. But at the end of the day, like everything about advantage play is a little weird and you have to just do it. You just have to spread and do what your spread calls for in the pro betting software. If you want to spread smaller, that's okay. Like you don't have to have the same EV goals as another person. You can play to a lower risk if you want to as well, but like you need to run it through the software first and make sure you actually do have an edge and be realistic about your EV.
I've found more through emails I get from non-members underbetting. I think there are people that just try to, train themselves because there's enough information out there, basic strategy count. We put it out there. There's enough free content. And then they get to the betting part and they just 1 to 5 it. Or 1 to 6 it. And then they send me an email and like, what do you think of this? Or I'm not winning or whatever it may be. And it's like, yeah, that's not worth your time doing this 1 to 5 spread on an 8 deck game or whatever.
Right. Especially if you're playing all. And so The other part of the underbetting thing, I think, is like a misunderstanding of the terminology. This comes up fairly often in the chat where people will be talking about, well, if I spread bigger, my risk is going to be bigger because they're only thinking about the top side of the spread. They're thinking about the max bet only. But the spread is not about how much you're betting at the top. It's about the distance between what you're betting at the bottom and what you're betting at the top. So you can make that spread bigger by playing lower minimums or by back counting and wonging in. Like that's the biggest spread you could have. You're spreading 0 to X.
Or wonging out.
Yes, wonging out too.
So with all the kind of different AP lanes, we'll call them, that you've been involved in and you're involved in right now, what are some of the more unusual situations that you've encountered in casinos lately, especially because your specialty is the dive, smelly casinos, it seems like?
Are we talking about unusual situations in general or as they relate to advantage play?
Yes.
Okay. So as far as just unusual things that have happened in casinos, there's a long list of them. The play I was talking about earlier when you had asked about video poker, while I was on that play, the bartender behind the bar tops got arrested for dealing meth out of the back of the casino.
No. Oh my God.
That's a more like just generally things that happen.
You weren't a buyer that day though, right?
No, sir. No, sir. Diet Coke will keep me up long enough. As far as just things casinos have done, that's a tough one. I don't think too many of them are like that far out into left field. It's just that they make a mistake running their numbers. Actually, you know what? Sports books do a lot of things that are just, what are you guys doing? What kind of number is this? An example of that would be last year around this time of year, NCAA tournament, March Madness, I was poking around for lines on to make the Sweet 16. So like not the main lines on the games or anything like that. And I think Captain Jack puts this really well where he talks about sports betting and these sort of exotic bets as a logic puzzle. And that's a lot easier way to approach it instead of thinking of it as a math problem because that's kind of intimidating. But so you look at this logic puzzle and I'm going through and there's a number that sticks out to me and that's Duke plus 330 to make the Sweet 16. I still wouldn't call myself an expert in sports betting. I still kind of treat it like a hobby. I'm not that into it, but that number stood out to me. So I go and I look at money lines for their first round game as the 4 seed against a 13. And the implied probability was like 87% to win the first game. And they were going to be favored over whoever they played in the second round. So you already know that like the break-even percentage has to be above 40, like it's above 40% for them to get there, which would be about plus 150. And you're getting 3.3 to 1 on it. You only have to win that bet a little less than 20% of the time, right? So, just if you poke around sports books and casinos enough, like you'll find stuff like that where it's just like, that doesn't make sense. How did they come to that number? I still don't understand how they came to that number, but I know after they bet it, it shot all the way down to 110.
Yeah, that seems about right. That's where it should have been.
I listened to our first podcast, or the one we did almost 5 years ago, to refresh my memory. And one of the things that stood out was all the unique things that you seem to have played in, only a few years of a career. And I was thinking about it. It's like the unique combination of perhaps some of it is that you live in an obscure market, but also you've got that like 1 in 1,000 AP personality where you're looking for all the things and then attacking them. So you're a bit of a unicorn in that way, the different things that you're playing. But as you are in casinos as much as you are and checking out all the various things, are there any trends that you've noticed? Or do you feel like you see any trends in the casinos over the last few years as far as games they've offered?
I've noticed table games offerings are getting a little more sparse. That doesn't mean that they're not out there, just a place that used to have 2 pits every day, maybe it only has 1 pit and all the tables are only open on the weekends and there's only one or 2 tables during the week. I think that's been a pretty common change. In general, things tend to get worse and not better. Just as a rule of thumb, like as an opportunity gets whacked, a casino starts to realize, oh, we need to change something. And that's the effect of it. And some of that's, video poker pay tables getting nerfed. Some of that's promotions like point multipliers going away. But the other thing is that they're always introducing new games. And I don't know, like it seems like they're offering more high variance stuff. Like it never goes lower variance because the gamblers want more variance. That's the whole purpose of the industry is variance, right? Like nobody would gamble if every time they push the button in a slot machine, they got 90 cents back on their dollar. They just wouldn't. And we wouldn't be allowed to play if every time we went to a blackjack table, we made exactly $100 every single hour. So it seems like that's the trend is things are getting higher in variance and there's more exotic stuff, more different blackjack variants that are coming out. And so, I think someone who's maybe a little more adept at analysis and using computers to like analyze games would probably find a lot of value in the new stuff.
So with that, I just want to add, I think you're right. For the most part, things don't get better. However, casinos do get lazy and they will hyper-focus on something because they got wrecked on video poker or they got wrecked on a promo or their blackjack has been attacked to no end because they had a good game for counting. And they forget about some other things. And they might get sloppy with procedures on games they're not looking at anymore because they're so hyper-focused. You do see less, even in bigger casinos, like less tables open all the time. Like they have closed pits and then they open them up as it gets busier on busy nights. I'm definitely seeing that. But like I've personally seen a lot more slop when it comes to like the hole carding lane because there's some other things that they seem to be very hyper-focused on. So in addition to what you said, Nichols, in regards to like new stuff, higher variant stuff coming out, opportunities galore there. Don't forget also that within casinos, there is a cyclical nature to them, and the old becomes new again quite often. So just keep your eye out for that. And I know that you've kind of experienced even some situations like that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And going off of that same thing, a lot of these things go in cycles too, where a casino gets hit really hard on something, they take a countermeasure against it, and so the APs stop going there. And then a few years later, they haven't been hit in a while, and now that opportunity comes back.
Yeah, we might even see that with deck penetration, where a market or a chain is like getting whacked from card counters, so they start cutting off a couple decks. And then they realize at some point, 6 months, a year, 2 years later, that it's costing them more money in rounds per hour, so they move the cut card further back than it was originally. I mean, we would see that in real time at some of the casinos we played in Washington State. The pen change, like clearly it was a top-down decision, like, oh no, they're cutting off 2 decks. And then 6 months later, they're cutting off a deck. So yeah, those things do go in cycles. You mentioned the higher variance nature, and we were talking about that earlier today, and that makes sense. And honestly, it kind of weeds out some of the more less experienced APs if they maybe don't have the tenacity or the bankroll for the variance. But how have you been able to cope with the swings, or how have your coping strategies evolved over the years?
I think the biggest coping strategy that's changed is just as you have more time under your belt and you have more results and a bigger sample size, you eventually come to a point where anytime you're going through a downswing, you can just look at your lifetime results and go, oh yeah, this is nothing. Whereas like earlier on, like that's a little tougher because, your first year or two of advantage play, one big downswing could mean you're in the red for your career. So I think that's one thing. And then the other is, I think having a good counselor or therapist is big. And that's a tough thing to do as a professional AP, is find someone who's a good fit. I mean, it's a tough thing to find a good fit for anybody, but it took a few different counselors before I found someone who was a good fit for me. And that's helpful, like not just like stuff in my personal life, but also like AP wise, to have someone who like understands what I do on some level, at least enough to accept that this is what this guy does for a living, to just sit there and listen. Because some stuff you don't want to, like maybe your AP friends would understand, but you don't really want to share it with them. You don't want to trauma dump on them and throw a temper tantrum. one of the first counselors I went to, like this is just an idea of how tough it can be to go through that. One of the first counselors I met with to try to get help for some of those mental health things, I mentioned card counting, and he said to me, I have to report intent to commit crimes, right? So it's rough out there. But if you put the work in to find someone, you can find a good mental health professional to work with. That's helpful, especially if you already have like pre-existing mental health stuff. Like I've got major depressive. So there's times of the year that I just go through episodes where I would need that, whether I was an AP or not. But the swings can definitely impact that. And I think just as important as managing the downswings is managing the upswings, because it's very easy when you're running like God to feel like you're God. And the consequences of that can be like playing something that's a little more on the margins than you would typically play, something that's outside of what your bankroll constraints really would allow for you to play. And that's how disaster strikes, right? Just like we were talking about overbetting before.
So the topic of mental health, obviously a really important one. And I love that you are so willing to share about, some struggles that you have and your belief in meeting with counselors and how important and how instrumental that can be. But I know you've also shared another important piece to your mental health, which is your peer group, your community, or your friends. Maybe talk about that a little bit and like BJA and what that's done for you too, managing swings and also what it's done for your mental health.
So right along with that, like having friends that like Stan Podolak is probably my closest AP friend. And having someone like, whether it's Stan or somebody else, like I talk to SD1 sometimes too, or Joe, just about the things that are going on, LEC as well, especially like someone who's operating in a similar lane as you, because you don't necessarily want to share all the information you have with somebody else. Like that's huge, because that's the person that's going to be able to tell you if you are doing something wrong, because sometimes you're not sure, especially when it comes to like sports betting or poker or something that's a little more qualitative. And the BJA community has been a big part of, that's how I met all those people for one, but even just like managing it is a helpful coping strategy for me, because like being able to be a part of the forum and work on the Casino 411 stuff makes you feel like you have some kind of purpose that's not just being a leech on the back of a bigger leech, because that's what professional gambling can feel like. Because there's a few other ones, but there's not very many professions where you can earn a living without providing a good or a service to anybody. So for me, like Blackjack Apprenticeship is huge, because I can like feel like I'm contributing to society, even if that's creating more smaller leeches.
Joe748 calls you BJ's resident expert on single deck. What are some of the art of card counting tips that you have when it comes to single deck?
Specific to single deck, specifically about art. There's some science things like composition dependent strategy, and that can be a part of the art. Like there's a couple of plays in single deck that look really weird, but they're correct. Like a pair of 7s against a 10.
Or the 12 against anything but a 5.
Yes, exactly. Like a 12 that's 10-2 versus a 10 that's like 5-7. And so a pair of 7s against a 10, if you can surrender, you surrender. But I haven't seen a surrender single deck that's not on a bar top. But if you can't surrender, you actually stand, and it has to do with like the removal of the 7s. Like you've lost 50% of your key card. And then like the 12 stuff, like 12 against a 4, for example, if it's 10-2 on the first hand of the deck, you hit it because you've removed a 10. And that stuff looks weird. It looks like not what a card counter does, because that's not basic strategy. So that can play into the art of it. And then the other thing that I think is probably the biggest thing is you don't need to spread as fat on single deck. You just don't. You don't need to go 1-20 on a single deck game. You can, and I have, but you don't need to. You can beat some of, especially the really high quality ones, like where you can still double any 2 cards. Like that's really rare in single deck now. Like a game like that, you can smash it with like a 1-4, 1-5 spread. Like the 1-5 we were talking about earlier, like we're thinking about 6 deck. Like 1-5 doesn't work with 6 deck that well. It's not amazing on double deck, but it could work. But single deck, like you can do all sorts of funky stuff with the size of your spread. There's some stuff that we typically I think only talk about at boot camps for super high quality games. But just you have more room to be creative with your bet sizing. Like you can open up a little bit bigger than normal and then make your spread look a little smaller that way too and duck down. And your N0 will still be perfectly reasonable. And now if you do go the 1 to 20 route, might not last very long, but the N0 can be super short on a single deck game. If you play a 1 to 20 spread on a like good, deeply dealt, rule of 6 or deeper single deck, you can get N0 down to like 30 hours.
Yeah, that's nice. So what are the challenges with single deck versus a shoe game?
I think the most obvious one that people would think about is it's similar to double deck. The count fluctuates so much that your bets are moving all the time. Doesn't take much time to run you down. But the other one that maybe people who haven't played it don't think about a lot is getting the table to yourself, or at least without too many people on the table. Because if you have too many people on the table, for those of you that don't know this, most of the time, single deck does not use a cut card to signal the shuffle. They deal a set number of rounds. And if they do use a cut card, it's questionable whether you should play that game. I could talk for an hour about the cut card effect, and I don't want to do that, so I'll leave it there. But so if you're playing a single deck game heads up, you should be getting 5 rounds, maybe 6, maybe even 7, depending on the dealer and how much discretion they have. If you're playing with one other player, or you're playing two-handed by yourself, you should be getting about 4 rounds. You know, there are some special dealers that will give you a 5th one, but generally 4. And then when you have 3 spots in play, it starts to get tricky because now only 3 rounds are getting dealt. And you could beat that game, but it's not the best use of your time because you're spending so much time shuffling. You're not getting very many betting opportunities. And now 4 or more players, they're either dealing 2 rounds or they're dealing 1 round. Well, if they're dealing 1 round, you're playing a continuous shuffler. You're not counting that game. And if they're dealing 2 rounds, you have a similar problem where you only have 1 round for the count to possibly get up. And then you only have 1 round to possibly bet into before it's shuffled away again. And so being able to find a table that's not crowded is probably the biggest challenge. Like if you go into, a place in Reno or Wendover, let's say, they know how to maximize the number of people playing without like paying too much to staff, right? They know how to minimize overhead. So they're not going to have all of their tables open all the time. And they're going to try to consolidate their players down into a few tables. So it can be a real challenge. Like you really have to focus on off hours and like right around shift change, even when they start to open more tables and now you can get grandfathered in at a lower minimum or something like that. That's the big problem. I like playing single deck. I can think of so many times that I thought I had this game to myself. I go and sit down, and as soon as I sit down, like 4 other people like fall out of the ceiling almost and just, oh, there they are. And now I can't play this game. So I just bought chips and now I'm getting up and leaving.
The same effect of when you start winning on a table and you have a heads up even a shoe game, but you start winning and people see the chips stacking up and then all of a sudden there's 5 other players at the table and you're like, gosh, dang it.
Right. And on a 6-deck game, that makes it less desirable, but like you can still play it. On a single deck, it might make the game just unbeatable.
Right. So let's take a step back to that meth dealer. So, because there's probably a lot of counters right now. They're like, what is this guy talking about? There's no single deck anymore. What kind of places are these single deck games alive in?
Well, I'll just say one of them is Reno. They've dealt single deck there forever. Now, the amount of single deck has gone down as time has gone on, but you can still find a 3-2 single deck game in Reno. Otherwise, you usually find them at really out of the way kind of places that they need some sort of hook to get people there, because who's going to drive out there to gamble when they could catch a flight to Vegas? So this is, rural Northern California, stuff like that, Northern Nevada as well. And I think, if you go on Casino 411, you can find that or find a lot of them. Maybe a couple of them aren't listed, but yeah, they tend to be really out of the way, like places that really need a gimmick.
Obviously, there's a lot about single deck that sounds amazing, but do you prefer that over a shoe game?
Yeah, I think I do. Well, it depends. If it's a high quality single deck game, I prefer it. I don't love if they're really strict with the rule of 6 where they're dealing exactly 5 heads up. That's not as great. And I don't know, there's something about actually touching the cards in a pitch game too that just Like, that's not the thing you should focus on as a card counter. You know, the ambiance and the feel of the game. You should focus on expected value. But I don't know. It's kind of nice to be able to touch the cards.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. That is the one thing that I love about Double Deck. I've played one single deck game or a pitch game, period. Touching the cards is, yeah, there's something about it. It's just got a different feel. It's got a different flow. How you hit, how you, like throwing the cards down a double and a split, like
you turn your first card over and it's an ace, and so you grab it like a dealer and flip over your second card to see if it's a 10.
You can have fun with it and just be kind of like, I think it can feed more into, you know, whatever act you're putting on too, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. And, you know, all of that said, though, like I still do like a good shoe game. I think the thing that makes me like a game more than anything else is the penetration. Almost any game can be fun. Even an 8-deck game, which sounds boring, and if you play a lot of single deck, it is boring because you're used to like, oh, running one, get the bets out there. And, you know, 8-deck, you got to wait around a little while. But even an 8-deck game, like I've played an 8-deck where they cut off, you know, half a deck, and that's just as fun, you know, because you get to the second half of the shoe and you might have 3 decks worth of cards that you're just firing into. And the good thing about the 8-deck and 6-deck shoes is if they have a double deck or a single deck available, they're probably not watching it as closely. So you can get away with a lot more ludicrous stuff.
I've played a lot of 8-deck in my career, and it's like it builds differently. You know, the counts are just changing so quick. Single deck, double deck, 8-deck, it like can build up to this huge count that you're playing for. It feels like half an hour. I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's like 5 minutes or something. But it feels, you know, just bet after bet after bet. All right. Well, we're gonna wrap it up here on the public podcast with you, but you're going to stick around for us and do a little overtime. I don't know what we're calling it. A little bonus round for the members.
OT.
Yep, sure thing.
But to kind of finish this up, what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned through your experiences that you could share that might help other APs?
So one that's more like focused on the AP side of things is, you know, do what you can to improve your critical thinking skills. And I know that might sound like a little intellectual, elitist, but I'm serious about that. I think developing your critical thinking skills and developing your understanding of the game of blackjack is what helps you break into other things. And I think you will have a lot easier time with deconstructing another game, or even just learning about another game that somebody else has deconstructed, because that's most of what I do, is like being able to tell bullshit from not bullshit, and being able to like look at a game and go, oh, there might be something there. Like with blackjack, that's, hey, we have an element of dependent trials because they don't shuffle. And oh, the house edge is really small. It wouldn't take much to overcome it. So if you can like think about the things that make one game beatable, you can often apply that to another. And if you're really good at critical thinking skills and doing logic puzzles or playing chess or something like that, you'll get to a place where you can figure those kind of things out. A little bit more like, I don't want to say not AP because it is related to AP, but a little bit less on the game side of it. I would say like don't romanticize advantage play too much, because like I was sort of guilty of that early on, and even before I knew what advantage play was, I sort of romanticized the idea of like being a character in a song Bob Dylan hasn't written yet. And you know, it's not exactly fun to sleep in your car in January in Black Hawk, Colorado. And like, don't pretend that it is. Like, there's no, you know, you're always going to go through some growing pains and there's going to be some hardships, but like enduring hardship for the sake of enduring hardship is just insane. And at the end of the day, advantage play should be, you know, well, one, it should be something you enjoy if you're pursuing it, at least on some level. And two, it should be sort of a means to an end. Like, even if that end is making a career out of it, like you're making money to survive. Like, it's not necessarily your purpose in life, and it's not necessarily like...
You mean like base your identity in?
Yeah, exactly. Like, you don't want to base your identity in it. You don't want to like fall in love with it to the point that it's the only thing you do. And I think what I was trying to get at when I was saying romanticize, like, don't ignore all the downsides too. Like, there's plenty of upside, but there are so many downsides to it as well. And you know, you need to weigh the pros and cons. You can't just like look at all the good stuff, look at all the winning times and all the And even the travel is something I got burnt out on pretty quickly. At a certain point, going to New Mexico is not an exciting thing anymore. And be honest with yourself about them, to see if this really is a good fit for you.
That's really interesting that you said that about ignoring the downsides. I'm reading this book and they talk about this guy is General Stockdale, I think was his name. And he was imprisoned, I want to say during Vietnam War, his plane went down, whatever. He's in this prison with a bunch of other captives, American soldiers. They were tortured, all this stuff. He made it out. It was 8 years that he was in there. And even just hearing about the story of that 8 years, it was pretty interesting. But when he was done, he's interviewed, and the guy that writes this book says, "Is there anyone that you just knew wasn't going to make it?" He said, "Oh yeah, the optimists." He said, basically, they called this the Stockdale, I think that's his name, paradox, which is, how do you say, I am going to make it out alive, yet face the reality of, I have no idea when. He said the people that said, oh, we'll be home by Christmas, and Christmas would pass, and they'd say, we'll be home by Easter, and Easter would pass. We'll be home by Thanksgiving. At some point, because they didn't face reality, they couldn't handle it. So the Stockdale paradox is, how do you keep that hope with also completely facing reality, eyes wide open? And I think that kind of applies to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to just say, Colin, every time we do a podcast, it's always, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but he's always like, man, I'm reading this book now. Colin is so good at keeping up with his reading, and I envy it. And there's always something deep coming out of it. So that was really nice. So any last story you want to share? Meth dealers.
Or sitting on imaginary friends.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't mentioned that one in a while. I believe I mentioned that one on the Tens and Aces one several years ago. And that, yeah, I mean, just you see all kinds of interesting people in the casino, and it's kind of a fun thing because you get to see all the characters. You have a ticket to the freak show. But at the same time, it's also kind of sad because you realize oh, this person doesn't have the mental faculties to be making financial decisions. This would have been in 2020, I think. And I was in Reno, and I go to sit down at the single deck game at the El Dorado, and this guy just he's not getting the words out, but he's clearly upset about something. And I look, to the dealer for, some comfort or something, what's going on. And she says that I sat on his imaginary friend and he's upset. And then the guy finally was getting the words out and telling me that I sat on Malcolm. And, and I'm sort of at a loss of what to do. This is the game that's open. I don't really want to just run away from this and go to another casino and play. I'm here. And I was on a team at the time. So I was I need to get hours in for the team. And the only thing I could think of to say to him was, I'm Malcolm now. And he was okay with that. He just accepted it. And, we sat there and played blackjack for a while. I think I won $1,000 or something and left without a back off, and just, I don't know, super short interaction, but it was very, very interesting.
He never knew Malcolm was so good at playing blackjack, did he?
I guess not.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time. And if you're a BJA member, then you can listen to part 2 in the BJA member area. And if you're not a BJA member, I encourage you to check it out. If you want to learn how to beat blackjack, if you need tools as a card counter or for networking and community, we believe BJA is the best place to learn, network, and get the tools you need to beat the casinos.